The dark glasses were not an accessory, they were a wall. The white ponytail, a banner. The stiff collar, a suit of armor. Karl Lagerfeld did not walk. He paraded, even when he was alone. But behind that flawless mask hid a man obsessed with control, with power, and with the idea of never growing old. He was revered as a god of fashion, capable of resurrecting dead houses and turning his own silhouette into a global logo. But he was also feared. His words could end careers. His decisions could sink empires. Karl didn't just design clothes. He designed destinies. For more than half a century, he ruled over Chanel and Fendi like an absolute emperor. But one question haunted him to the end. Was he a visionary genius or an aesthetic dictator trapped in his own creation? Under the glare of the spotlights, he seemed immortal. In the shadows, he was a man tormented by his own demons. This is not the story of the elegant couturier everyone applauded. This is the story of the emperor who turned his life into an endless runway and who paid the highest price for being Karl Lagerfeld. Karl Otto Lagerfeld was born in Hamburg, Germany, in 1933. In an age scarred by uncertainty and the shadows of war, he came into a comfortable household. His father, Otto, a successful businessman importing condensed milk, and his mother, Elizabeth, cultured, refined, and armed with a sharp character that left a permanent mark on her son. He never endured the hunger or devastation that crushed so many families in post-war Germany, but Karl always felt different, like destiny itself had chosen him for something greater. From the beginning, he revealed an almost feverish obsession with drawing. Hours vanished as he hunched over paper, sketching impossible dresses for imaginary women. While other children shouted and played in the streets, Karl withdrew into the solitude of his room, conjuring worlds that did not yet exist. His mother, with her razor-sharp eye, never indulged him. She was demanding, unsparing. Years later, he would recall her voice like a blade. If you're going to draw, do it better than everyone else. Otherwise, don't bother. That harsh counsel, cruel as it seemed, became the compass that guided him for the rest of his life. Young Karl did not live only in his drawings. He surrounded himself with culture. He devoured books, picked up languages, studied the world with the restless hunger of someone determined to escape the borders of his provincial city. Hamburg felt too small, too gray, too suffocating. Paris shimmered in his mind like a promise, brilliant, sophisticated. A place where fashion and art intertwined in a secret language he believed he was destined to speak. At school, his aloofness and air of superiority made him a target of ridicule. He was no obedient child. He was arrogant, self-assured, fully aware of his talent. He did not seek to belong. He sought to rise above. That mixture of isolation and pride made him strange to those around him. But it also forged in him a strength, the will to walk alone, no matter how hard the path. In 1952, still a teenager, he persuaded his mother to move with him to Paris. It was a leap into the void, but Karl was certain his destiny could never be written in Germany. He carried with him portfolios crammed with sketches, his style still unformed, but already charged with hunger for perfection. The city of light awaited him, offering the chance to reinvent himself from nothing. Thus ended the first chapter of his life. A German boy with the soul of an artist, hardened by his mother's criticism, armed with a talent that was beginning to take shape. Karl was ready to confront the world's capital of fashion, though he did not yet know the choice would set him against names that would echo through history. Paris, 1952. The city pulsed with ambition, light, and secrets. It was the capital of desire, where dreams could crown you or crush you in a matter of days. Into this arena stepped Karl Lagerfeld, barely a teenager from Hamburg, clutching a portfolio of sketches and a will of iron. He had not come to learn. He had come to conquer. Fate disguised itself as opportunity in the form of the International Woolmark Prize, a competition designed to unearth the next titans of fashion. Karl submitted a meticulously crafted coat, drawn with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The jury was enthralled. He won. But he was not alone. Another young, hopeful, gentle-eyed Yves Saint Laurent, triumphed with a dress. Two names, two paths, an unspoken rivalry etched from that very moment. Saint Laurent would be hailed as a prodigy, Karl, the cold, calculating outsider. His victory opened the doors of Balmain, where he absorbed discipline and craft. But Karl was no humble apprentice. He studied, observed, plotted. Soon he was elevated to Jean Patou, becoming creative director at just 21. The role was immense, and his collections daring, irreverent, too far ahead drew harsh criticism. Insolent, arrogant. They sneered. Karl did not falter. He understood something others did not. Fashion was no sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and he had no intention of being a foot soldier. Paris was ruthless, devouring talent, youth, and illusions. But Karl would not be devoured. He stalked the city with a distance that unnerved others. Always immaculate, always untouchable. He did not seek friends, he sought power. While Saint Laurent soared like a comet at Dior, Karl charted another path. Slower, more calculated, almost invisible. He did not need to be beloved. He needed to be indispensable. With every sketch, every rejection transformed into fuel. He sharpened himself like a blade. Paris began to understand. This young German was no passerby. He was a conqueror in waiting, an emperor in the making. Rome, 1965. While Paris glittered with the names of Dior and Saint Laurent, Karl Lagerfeld crossed the Alps to accept a challenge few wanted: fur. To many designers, fur was a relic, stiff, outdated, a symbol of an old world that no longer spoke to modernity. But to Karl, it was an unexplored canvas, raw material, begging to be reinvented. The Fendi sisters, 5 women of formidable will, ran the Roman house with pride and tradition. They greeted the young German with cautious curiosity. What could this aloof outsider, with his piercing gaze hidden behind dark glasses, bring to their heritage? They soon found out. Karl hadn't come to respect the rules. He had come to burn them. It didn't take long for him to earn a nickname, Il Giovane Barbaro, the young barbarian. Not because he was crude, but because he stormed into their world with fearless irreverence. He shredded convention. He cut fur into shapes no one had imagined, dyed it with shocking colors, combined it with fabrics that broke every boundary. What had once been heavy, solemn, and aristocratic became light, playful, even subversive. Out of this rebellion emerged a new emblem, the now iconic FF logo. Many assumed it meant Fendi. In truth, Karl called it Fun Fur. 2 letters that shattered the old codes and rebranded fur for a new era. It was more than a logo, it was a declaration. Fur was no longer untouchable tradition. It was fashion, alive, and laughing at its own past. At Fendi, Karl perfected the rhythm that would define his empire. Speed, productivity, total control. He could sketch dozens of designs in a single night, each fresh, each unexpected. To the sisters, it seemed like he conjured ideas out of thin air. What impressed them most was that Karl never diluted Fendi's Italian soul. He didn't erase the brand's identity, he magnified it, projecting it onto the world stage. While other designers strained under the pressure of a single house, Karl was mastering the art of multiplicity. By day, he was Fendi's alchemist in Rome. By night, he was a restless freelancer in Paris. The industry began to whisper about his endurance, his ability to live 10 creative lives at once without faltering. He was not just a designer, he was a machine, a force of nature wrapped in a starched collar. The results spoke for themselves. Fendi, once a respected but provincial name, surged into international prominence. Each season, Karl pushed further, dismantling expectations and rebuilding them with audacity. He didn't aim to please. He aimed to shock, to seduce, to provoke. That audacity became the lifeblood of Fendi, and the sisters gave him their unwavering loyalty in return. Decades would pass, yet Karl never abandoned the house. Even at the height of his reign at Chanel, he remained bound to Fendi. It was proof of his rare loyalty and of his understanding that power was not in fleeting triumphs, but in enduring empires. Rome anointed him not just as a designer, but as a conqueror. At Fendi, Karl proved he could take a heritage weighed down by tradition and make it soar without killing its spirit. It was the rehearsal for a far greater miracle, the resurrection of a giant thought to be beyond saving. Chanel was waiting. And with Chanel, Karl would no longer be a barbarian storming the gates. He would become the emperor who built his own throne. Paris, early 1980 seconds. The House of Chanel, once the very heartbeat of modern elegance, was collapsing under the weight of its own legend. Coco Chanel had died a decade earlier, and with her, the spirit of the Maison seemed to have vanished. The brand had become stale, its tweed suits dismissed as relics for wealthy grandmothers. Fashion critics wrote of Chanel in the past tense, as if it were already embalmed in the history books. The perfume still sold, but the couture was a museum piece. Chanel was, in every sense, a sleeping giant on the edge of the grave. Enter Karl Lagerfeld. In 1983, the Wertheimer family, the owners of Chanel, called upon the German outsider, the so-called barbarian, who had shaken Fendi. It was a gamble, almost reckless. Who better to revive a legend than a man who had no reverence for sacred cows? Where others saw a corpse, Karl saw potential. Chanel is not dead, he told them. She is just out of fashion. From the beginning, Karl knew that imitating Coco would be a mistake. Chanel herself had been a revolutionary, a breaker of rules. To honor her, he would have to break her codes, not preserve them. If Coco were alive, she would hate what I do, Karl laughed once. And that is precisely why I do it. He took the house's holy symbols, the tweed suit, the pearls, the black and white palette, the camellia flower, and tore them apart. Then he rebuilt them with irreverence. Skirts shorter, jackets sharper, silhouettes bolder. He injected sexuality into austerity, mischief into tradition. The matronly Chanel suit became chic again, desired by women who wanted to look powerful, young, untouchable. What had been a museum relic was reborn as a weapon of seduction. The transformation was electric. Suddenly, the world's most photographed women models, actresses, socialites, were wearing Chanel again. The very pieces that had seemed like antiques became statements of modern glamour. Karl had done what seemed impossible. He had resurrected a ghost. But he didn't stop there. Karl understood something fundamental. In the age of mass media, a brand was not just clothing. It was spectacle. Each season, he transformed the Grand Palais into a cathedral of excess, a train station with locomotives steaming onto the runway, a supermarket where models pushed carts in tweed jackets, a space rocket blasting off beneath the glass dome. Chanel was no longer a fashion show. It was theater, cinema, mythology. Buying a dress was not buying fabric, it was buying entry into Karl's universe. And that universe revolved around one axis: power. Under Karl, Chanel became the most powerful brand in the world. He had taken what was nearly dead and made it immortal, creating collections that were at once classic and scandalously contemporary. He turned Chanel into both heritage and revolution, past and future, tradition and provocation. The critics who had doubted him were silenced. Yes, he was irreverent. Yes, he was arrogant. But he had done what no one else could. Chanel was not just alive, it was untouchable. Not everyone applauded. Purists accused him of betraying Coco's legacy, of vulgarizing her codes. But Karl dismissed them with his usual venom. The worst thing in fashion, he declared, is to be boring. And under his rule, Chanel was never boring. The resurrection of Chanel was also the coronation of Karl Lagerfeld. Versace ruled Milan with glittering provocation. Armani dominated with austere power suits. But Karl had claimed the greatest throne of all: Chanel, the house of Coco herself. From that moment on, he was no longer just a designer. He was the emperor of fashion. With each collection, with each spectacle, Karl fed the myth. The tweed jacket became eternal. The double C logo became a global language. And Karl, standing at the center in his dark glasses and white ponytail, became indistinguishable from the brand he had revived. Chanel had belonged to Coco. Now, it belonged to Karl. He had not only resurrected a dead house, he had built an empire of his own image, woven into every seam of Chanel's fabric. And the fashion world, dazzled and terrified, bowed before the emperor who had turned a corpse into the most powerful symbol of luxury the world had ever seen. By the late 1990 seconds, Karl Lagerfeld was no longer merely a man. He had become a silhouette, a logo, a character scripted with the precision of his own hand. Dark sunglasses, starched white collars, a powdered ponytail, leather gloves that concealed as much as they revealed. It was a uniform, yes, but also a mask, a shield, an identity stronger than flesh. Karl didn't dress each morning. He armored himself. This transformation was deliberate, an act of pure self-design. In his earlier years, photographs showed a softer, more mutable Karl. But he understood, better than anyone, the power of image in an era where perception ruled over truth. Coco had made herself into a legend through her black dresses and pearls. Karl would go further. He would become a caricature, a living logo. "I am a cartoon of myself," he once sneered, "and I like it." But beneath this cartoon was obsession. And beneath obsession was fear. Fear of aging, fear of irrelevance, fear of being ordinary. In 2001, Karl shocked the world by unveiling his new body 40 kilos lighter, carved to fit the razor-thin silhouette of Hedi Slimane's Dior Homme suits. The diet was brutal, the discipline inhuman. He didn't do it for health or vanity, but for style. For Karl, the body was merely another mannequin to be altered, perfected, bent to the will of fashion. His persona was more than aesthetic, it was strategy. In an industry where designers rose and fell like seasons, Karl's mask gave him permanence. No one saw him sweat, no one saw him weaken, no one saw him age. He became untouchable, an immortal figure who seemed to step out of time itself. As long as Karl wore the uniform, Karl would remain eternal. And yet, the mask was also a prison. Behind the sharp collars and sardonic wit, Karl rarely revealed himself. He kept his circles small, his intimacies guarded. He preferred the company of books, of sketch pads, of his beloved cat Choupette, rather than human vulnerability. In public, he was always Karl Lagerfeld, never simply Karl. The man disappeared into the character, until even his closest collaborators struggled to separate myth from flesh. His words, delivered with icy precision, fed the legend. "Sweatpants are a sign of defeat. Trendy is the last stage before tacky. I design like I breathe, you don't ask why." Each phrase was a headline, each quote a dagger. He understood that in a media-driven world, words could be as powerful as clothes. And so he honed them into weapons, branding himself as the witty, cruel emperor who never hesitated to say what others feared. The paradox was intoxicating. Karl presented himself as eternal, invincible, larger than life. And yet, the act of building this character revealed his deepest fragility. He did not want to be remembered as a mortal man, flawed and fading. He wanted to be remembered as an icon, sharp and eternal. So he erased himself, piece by piece, until only the character remained. By then, the world no longer asked who Karl Lagerfeld was. It didn't matter. He had succeeded in his greatest creation, Karl Lagerfeld, the brand, the myth, the logo. Just as Coco Chanel had become more than a woman, Karl had become more than a man. But while Coco's legend was crafted after her death, Karl lived long enough to witness himself turn into a symbol. It was, perhaps, his most exquisite design, and also his cruelest. The emperor's crown glittered, but its edges were sharp. If Karl Lagerfeld built a myth of elegance and immortality, he also cultivated a reputation for cruelty, arrogance, and ruthless authority. Behind the dark glasses lurked a tongue as sharp as his shears, a mind as cold as the steel needles that stitched his creations. Karl was not afraid of offense, he thrived on it. His words were weapons. He mocked women for their weight, calling them unworthy of fashion's fantasy. He dismissed entire movements with a sneer. He labeled singers ugly, actresses boring, rivals mediocre. He declared that sweatpants were a sign of defeat, that aging was disgusting, that he himself was a caricature, and that's the point. Each phrase was a bomb dropped into the media landscape, sparking outrage, headlines, endless debate. But Karl never apologized. For him, provocation was not a flaw, it was a strategy. Better to be hated and feared than forgotten. Inside his studios, the myth hardened into tyranny. At Chanel and Fendi, he ruled with absolute control. Deadlines were brutal, expectations impossible. Assistants whispered of sleepless nights, of sketches that had to be delivered in hours, of fear as constant as fabric. Karl demanded not only excellence but submission. He inspired awe, yes, but also terror. One careless mistake, one uninspired suggestion, and his scorn could erase a career. To work under Karl was to serve a monarch, intoxicating, dangerous, exhausting. His rivalries fueled the darkness. The longest and most venomous was with Yves Saint Laurent, the boy wonder who had shared the stage with him at the Woolmark Prize. Where Saint Laurent was fragile, sensitive, adored, Karl was calculating, cruel, relentless. Their competition spanned decades, laced with insults and betrayals. Karl's comments about Saint Laurent were barbed daggers, reminders that admiration was something he rarely offered, envy never admitted. The obsession with youth was another shadow that consumed him. Karl despised aging not only in himself but in the world around him. He surrounded himself with young models, young muses, young bodies that reflected his vision of eternal style. His infamous weight loss was not a triumph of health but an act of war against time itself. He starved his body to fit into the slim suits of another designer, as though denying mortality with every button he could fasten. Critics called him elitist, out of touch, even monstrous. They accused him of reinforcing impossible standards, of perpetuating cruelty disguised as glamour. And perhaps they were right, but Karl never sought redemption. He did not want to be seen as kind, or fair, or even good. He wanted to be remembered. And cruelty, in his eyes, was another kind of power. Yet there was a paradox in this darkness. For all his barbs and tyranny, Karl was also capable of immense loyalty. He cared for Jacques de Basher through his illness until his death. He remained with Fendi for over 5 decades, an unheard-of tenure in fashion. Even his cruelty had a strange consistency. He was as harsh with himself as he was with others, never allowing a crack in the mask, never permitting weakness. The dark side of Karl Lagerfeld was not an accident. It was a construction, as deliberate as his uniforms, as theatrical as his shows. He knew that every empire needs fear as much as it needs love. And so he became both the genius who resurrected fashion's greatest house and the tyrant who ruled it without mercy. In the end, Karl's cruelty became part of his mythology. To speak of him was to speak of brilliance laced with venom, of beauty stitched with razor blades. He was proof that greatness and darkness can coexist, intertwined like the black and white of Chanel itself. The emperor reigned, but the emperor also punished. And that, perhaps, was the true secret of Karl Lagerfeld. He was not only a designer of clothes, he was a designer of fear. Karl Lagerfeld reigned as an emperor, and emperors are rarely surrounded by equals. For decades, nothing happened at Chanel or Fendi without his signature. No seam approved, no silhouette paraded unless it passed beneath his cold gaze. Journalists called him the Kaiser of Fashion, and the title fit: aloof, absolute, untouchable. His power was immense, but power has a silent twin solitude. Those who brushed against his private world often spoke of its emptiness. Karl, the man behind the myth, revealed himself only in fragments. He loved the spectacle, the flashbulbs, the roar of an audience. Yet when the lights faded, he returned to an existence marked by distance. His closest and most enduring bond had been with Jacques de Basher, the decadent Parisian dandy who lived and died like a character out of a tragic novel. Their relationship was enigmatic. Karl insisted it was never physical, but it was, by his own admission, one of the great loves of his life. When Jacques succumbed to AIDS in 1989, Karl was there until the end, a vigil keeper in the face of death. The loss cut him deeply, though he never wore his grief. He buried it beneath his armor. After Jacques, the walls around Karl thickened. He became even more elusive, retreating into his sanctuaries. His sketchbooks, his photography, his vast library of over 300,000 volumes. "Books are my drugs," he once said. And indeed, they were his companions, silent, tireless, obedient. His other confidant was a cat, Choupette, the white Burman with sapphire eyes, pampered with maids and meals on porcelain. To outsiders, it seemed eccentric, even absurd. But for Karl, Choupette was more than a pet. She was a witness, a presence in a life otherwise devoid of intimacy. The irony was devastating. The man who dressed the world, who created universes of desire, lived largely alone. Dinner parties were rare, lovers non-existent. The character he had built, the sunglasses, the collars, the wit sharpened into knives, was a fortress that kept admirers enthralled and companions away. He had chosen to be eternal, and eternity is a lonely place. Still, Karl did not pity himself. He harnessed solitude as fuel. While others rested, he drew. While others sought comfort, he worked. Fashion was not just his profession. It was his addiction, his escape, his reason for existence. Solitude, which might have crushed a lesser man, drove him instead to create endlessly, compulsively. He could not stop, and he did not want to. Yet, beneath the surface, the cracks were visible. Those who knew him spoke of an unspoken melancholy, an absence that not even applause could fill. In the Grand Palais, with thousands rising to their feet, he stood like a king crowned again and again. But when the curtains fell, the emperor walked back into silence. Karl Lagerfeld was power incarnate, but power had stripped him of something simpler, the ability to be merely human. His throne was magnificent, but it was also a solitary chair in a palace too vast, too empty, echoing with the ghosts of ambition and the soft purr of a single white cat. Karl Lagerfeld spent half a century breathing life into other people's empires. Chanel, Fendi, even Chloe in his youth. But in the shadows of those towering names, he was also constructing something more intimate, more dangerous, an empire of himself. The brand Karl Lagerfeld never rivaled Chanel in power or prestige, but it revealed his ultimate ambition. He didn't just want to design clothes, he wanted to be the design. His silhouette became a logo. The white ponytail, the high collar, the black sunglasses. It appeared on t-shirts, handbags, perfumes, even vinyl figurines. Where Armani had his suits and Versace his Baroque extravagance, Karl's brand was distilled into his own body. He had achieved the impossible. He had turned his image into a trademark. But his personal legacy was not merely about products. It was about philosophy. Karl proved that in the modern era, the designer could eclipse the house, that the man could become more recognizable than the logo he served. Coco Chanel had created a myth after her death. Karl created his while still alive, walking the earth as a caricature made flesh. And yet, here lay the paradox. For all his branding brilliance, the question lingered. Whose legacy was stronger, Karl's or Chanel's? Without Karl, Chanel might have remained a dusty museum. Without Chanel, Karl might have remained a talented mercenary, forever flitting between houses. Together they fused into something greater. But when his time ended, would history remember Chanel reborn, or Karl crowned through Chanel? His personal label revealed his craving to democratize his myth. Unlike the untouchable couture of Chanel, the Karl Lagerfeld line offered t-shirts printed with his cartoonish face, sneakers and jeans carrying his name. It was Karl, both elite and accessible, high priest and street vendor, the emperor and the pop icon. That contradiction, arrogant yet populist, was pure Lagerfeld. But beyond clothing, his true legacy was cultural. He taught the world that fashion was no longer just fabric and thread, but theater, branding, identity. He turned designers into celebrities, shows into cinema, logos into religions. He blurred the line between art and commerce, between person and persona. And in that blur, he thrived. When he died, the debate erupted. Was Karl Lagerfeld the guardian of Chanel's immortality? Or had Chanel merely been the stage on which Karl performed his greatest role? Perhaps both. Perhaps that was the brilliance of his legacy, that he and the brand became inseparable, locked together in eternity. The man had vanished. The silhouette remained. His name, stitched into merchandise and immortalized in pop culture, outlived him. His final trick was not a collection, nor a spectacle. It was himself, Karl Lagerfeld, designer, emperor, brand, myth. February 2019. The Grand Palais in Paris, long Karl Lagerfeld's cathedral of spectacle, stood transformed once more. Over the decades, he had turned that glass palace into a train station with steam engines, a rocket launch pad, a supermarket, even a beach. Each season was theater, a new fantasy pulled from the mind of a man who never stopped dreaming. But this time, the stage was different. The floor was blanketed in white, chalets framed with frosted windows, smoke curling from painted chimneys. The scene was a snow-covered alpine village, frozen in time. The audience filled the seats with an unease they could not name. Something was missing, something vital. Karl Lagerfeld, the emperor of Chanel, the unshakable silhouette who had always emerged at the end of the runway, was not there. He had died only days earlier, at 85, leaving the fashion world stunned and hollow. The show they were about to witness was no longer just a collection. It was a requiem. The music began, soft and haunting, and the models appeared like apparitions in tweed coats dusted with snowflakes. Their faces were solemn, their steps deliberate. Each garment carried echoes of Karl's codes, the pearls, the camellias, the sharp black and white contrasts. But now those symbols felt like memorials, tokens of a vanished creator. The air was heavy, the silence between songs unbearable. Penelope Cruz, dressed as a model, clutched a single white camellia as she walked the runway. It was a gesture of farewell, a flower for the man who had revived Chanel and made it eternal. Some models wept openly, their tears smudging makeup, their shoulders trembling as they carried not just fashion but grief. The audience, too, was overcome. Editors, celebrities, friends, all stood trapped in that frozen village, witnesses to a farewell staged by Karl himself, even in absence. When the final notes faded, there was no immediate applause, just silence, reverent and raw, as though the Grand Palais itself were holding its breath. Then, slowly, the audience rose, clapping, crying, shouting his name. The ovation shook the glass dome, echoing like thunder across Paris. But the emperor was not there to bow. His chair was empty, his presence only a memory stitched into every seam. Outside the Grand Palais, tributes erupted worldwide. Newspapers hailed him as the Kaiser of Fashion. Designers called him irreplaceable. Fans flooded social media with drawings of his silhouette, the ponytail and sunglasses immortalized in black and white sketches. At Fendi, at Chanel, at his own brand, memorials bloomed like shrines. His beloved cat, Choupette, became a strange symbol of mourning, her sapphire eyes staring out from photographs as if she, too, understood the loss. The last show was more than a farewell. It was a coronation in death. Karl Lagerfeld had staged his own departure with the same theatrical instinct that guided his life. No coffin, no funeral procession, just models striding through a snowy dream, leaving footprints that led not to an end, but to immortality. The world realized, in that moment, that Karl's greatest creation had not been a jacket, or a logo, or even Chanel reborn. It had been the myth of Karl Lagerfeld himself, an emperor who ruled until the last breath, and who even in death commanded the runway. The snow kept falling in the Grand Palais, soft and endless, covering everything in white silence. And in that silence, Karl became eternal. Karl Lagerfeld lived as an emperor and departed as a myth. For decades, he ruled the catwalks with absolute authority, shaping not only what the world wore, but how it dreamed. He resurrected Chanel from its grave, reinvented Fendi, and built himself into a logo more recognizable than the brands he served. He was, at once, genius and tyrant, visionary and provocateur. He wanted everything, and he got it. Yet his triumph came at a cost. The sunglasses that hid his eyes, the collars that caged his neck, the ponytail powdered into rigidity, these were not just style. They were walls. Behind them lived a man terrified of weakness, a man who chose solitude over intimacy, image over vulnerability. He transformed himself into a cartoon, and the cartoon consumed the man. Karl Lagerfeld no longer existed as flesh. He existed as myth. That was, perhaps, his greatest design. Coco Chanel had become legend after her death. Karl achieved it in life. He understood that immortality lies not in fabric so easily forgotten, but in symbols. His silhouette was his masterpiece, his ultimate creation, eternal and untouchable. And yet, the question lingers. What is his true legacy? Was it Chanel, reborn under his reign into the world's most powerful fashion house? Was it Fendi, transformed from a Roman family atelier into an international force? Or was it simply Karl Lagerfeld himself, the emperor who ruled with cruelty and wit, whose every quote, every gesture, every outfit was staged for eternity? Perhaps the answer is all of it. Perhaps his genius was to weave his own myth into the fabric of every brand he touched, so that in speaking of Chanel or of Fendi, the world will forever whisper his name. The emperor is gone, but the empire remains. And each time the lights dim on a runway, each time a model walks clad in tweed and pearls, each time a silhouette in dark glasses appears on a page, Karl Lagerfeld lives again. He was not merely a designer of clothes. He was a designer of identity, of image, of destiny. A man who refused to be mortal, who chose to be eternal. And he succeeded. Because when we remember Karl Lagerfeld, we do not see a man, we see a myth.